Thank you. Thank you to the four of you for coming on out. Mr. Klein, I wanted to just start with you. I thought you made some very poignant assessments about the suspicious activity reports in particular. You mentioned about just, millions of these every year that are being used. But as far as I could tell from your testimony, it doesn't seem like there's any feedback, any sense of, are these useful? Is that correct?
Correct. Banks are not judged on the quality of their performance, they're judged on the quantity. And the consequence is the bank has every incentive to file more without getting information as to the quality of it. This is how filings have increased tenfold in 20 years. In my written testimony, I cite some work that shows that the ability of it to lead to prosecutions for tax evasion, one of the primary purposes of AML, has been extremely thin.
And so we're seeing this situation where the banks are filing millions of these, costing them a lot of money and time, but we're not certain whether or not it doesn't sound like they're getting any real feedback in terms of whether or not those have been useful. And I think you cited, in fact, in terms of some reports, it seemed like, the IRS prosecutors maybe use only a few hundred of some out of millions of different reports that come before them. Is that correct?
It's correct. 327 reports started a prosecution on tax evasion out of about 27 million. That's a piece from Nick Anthony at Cato. And let me just say, the way that I've come to analogize this is the thesis of the entire AML process is like a criminal is like a scuba diver swimming deep in the dark ocean in order to evade detection. And the money from the criminal activities are like the bubbles that float to the air. And the idea here is that you use the data that comes in SARs and other things to find the bubbles and go down. But in point of fact, all we're doing in the current process is blowing air into the system. I don't understand who's reading all of these SAR reports. And this gets to the point about state licensed cannabis that was raised earlier. That's federally illegal. If the DEA wants to go in and shut down any cannabis company in a state, they can. But you don't need a bank report to tell you where the cannabis shop is. It's called Google Maps. It'll work really well. Why are we forcing the banks to continue to file all of these things?
Because this is putting pressure upon the banks. When we're talking about reputational risks, these are some of the calculations that banks are making in terms of having to file these reports. One thing I wanted to ask you, I thought you made a very convincing argument in terms of the currency transaction reporting, in terms of the lifting of that number that hasn't been lifted in quite some time. But I guess I wanted to ask more specificity when it came to the suspicious activity reports. Do you have more concrete reform proposals there that our committee should be looking into as we're thinking about our next steps?
Yeah, no, I absolutely. So for example, on state licensed cannabis, right? If you're running a state licensed cannabis business, you should be treated like other businesses. If law enforcement wants to deal with you, go to the state capitol, find where you are. Why you're being treated differently makes absolutely no sense. The second thing is, let's be clear on what the priorities are for banks to file SARs. There are areas where I think more suspicious activity like elder abuse, which has been the subject of another CFPB report, is one where you could be providing more information. But there's a whole host of different categories of activities. And I think what we need is a whole blue sky approach where Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the bank regulators are brought before this committee and the public to discuss a prioritization of what we're going after. Because in the 50 years we've been doing this regime, we keep adding more targets, never taking anybody off the list.
No, I think that's right. And, I have to say, Mr. McCauley, when I was, hearing your testimony and just, I'm sorry for what you went through in that kind of capacity. And when we look at the reputational harm or reputational risk that banks are considering here, yes, it certainly seems like this excessive amount of reporting, other things like that are adding to it. And I think one thing I hope we can all agree on is, having greater sense of transparency across the board, but then also some sort of feedback loop, some process by which to try to appeal, because it's not just on the SARs, but, also the customers are unaware that, something has been filed about them. And so there's just multiple layers of lack of transparency on that front. And, also just, I want to just raise this, not ask a question, but, Mr. Klein, also you showed how, with CheckX, for instance, and other components, again, that sense of transparency is missing, as well as that lack of ability to appeal. So it just seems like that's something systematic that I think this committee can hopefully dive in deeper on. So thank you so much. Now you'll back.
Senator Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.